Howdy folks, today we're teaching advanced knife skills. So the idea here is hopefully you already have a strong fundamental of knife skills. Maybe you've taken a class or you've watched Owen's video, How to Cut Like a Chef, and you've probably got a decent quality kitchen knife that you're having fun using. Today we're going to build off of those fundamentals. I'm going to teach you how to get more precise, more detailed with your cuts, and really up your presentation. This isn't stuff you need to do every day in your home kitchen, but these are tricks that professional chefs use to level up their cooking and really up their presentation game that are going to help you at home. So if you got dinner guests you want to impress, or you just want to spend more time cutting with your favorite knife, these tips and tricks are going to help you out a ton. A lot of what we're doing today is just going to be focused on precision, getting cuts as consistent or as small as you can. This is going to help things cook more evenly, but it also means that you can bring more color into your dishes and your presentation can just be like up here, professional level. So let's start with our friend, the radish. This is one of my favorite vegetables. This is going to show us how to cut a little more precisely than we might normally. So we're going to grab our kitchen knife with this basic pinch grip here. This is almost always how I hold my kitchen knives, by the blade. It's going to give you more control and more ability to drive the knife exactly where you want it. And I'm using a Santoku, about a mid-sized blade that most people are comfortable with. So when it comes to being precise with your cuts, the name of the game is to take your time, practice, right? Nobody's going to be a pro at first, but with a little bit of practice and a little bit of patience, you can get pretty good. That's really the only thing that separates you from a professional chef, is how sharp your knife is and how much practice you've had. So we're gonna take our radish, and we're going for some paper thin slices here. Say we wanna put them on top of our tacos or a salad. So we are going to just trim up the end of our radish and get rid of that. And we're gonna work in a sliding motion here. By sliding the knife, we can use less force and let the knife do more of the work for us. That's gonna give us more precision. We're gonna use the knuckle of our index finger there, and we're gonna brace the knife up against that, because that's gonna allow us to control the thickness of our cut. And then we're just gonna make the smallest cut we can into this radish. And then we're gonna slide our knife forward like so. And maybe the first couple aren't gonna be super good, maybe they're too thin, but with a little bit of adjustment, you can get some nice thin slices. Look how slow I'm going. I'm really taking my time here. And with each cut, I'm just inching the knife back a little bit and sliding it forward, bracing it against that index finger, like so. Right, this isn't difficult. It just requires a little bit of practice and a little bit of patience. Look at that, beautiful paper thin radish. Easy, right? Obviously I've done this a lot of times before, but it really is just a matter of screwing it up a whole bunch until you get good at it, right? Most of those cuts I made at the beginning weren't perfect. What I'm learning to do is to steer the knife so that I cut straight, to slide the blade so that I get a smooth, clean cut. And I'm just getting comfortable with that motion. And you're gonna make a lot of mistakes at first, but it's really important. Just like when you're practicing an instrument, it's important to get precise before you get fast. And speed will come with practice. You know, being fast in the kitchen, especially if you're going for presentation, isn't really necessary. You know, hopefully if you're having guests over for dinner, you have all day to perfect these garnishes and these cuts. And so you can spend a little more time being zen with your knives, enjoying that cutting process. But hey, look at that. By the time I got to the end of the radish, we've got beautiful paper thin slices that are gonna look really gorgeous on, you know, maybe a seafood preparation, tacos, salads, and if you get a few that are too thick, you can just eat them. Once we get that down, then we can start to move our knife a little bit faster, right? But don't focus on speed at first. That'll come with practice. And I find that once I get the hang of a cut, once I start speeding up, I actually end up being more precise. Once you get that confidence, you end up not overthinking it too much, and you end up getting much cleaner cuts. So practice that, get something like a radish that you can slice really paper thin, and just practice, practice, practice. Do potatoes, you know, make yourself potato chips from scratch, and just get a lot of practice in when you have a bit of spare time. That's gonna allow you to see a monumental increase in your skills in a pretty short period of time. And once you get good at this, you may find that going faster is actually easier for you. You know, you will find your rhythm with time, and once you get into that pace that feels right to you, you can end up being a lot more precise in a fraction of the time. Once we get that precision dialed in, we can start to incorporate that into a ton of other foods. Those nice paper thin slices are really versatile for things that, you know, are not just radishes, like this radicchio, or any hearty leafy vegetable like a cabbage, anything that you want to thinly shave. So we're going to cut our radicchio down into quarters like this, and we're just looking for nice thin filaments that we can use as a garnish. So again, using that index knuckle to kind of help guide my cuts. And if your first few cuts aren't the most precise, it's not the end of the world. You don't work in a Michelin star restaurant. You can see with something denser like this, I'm pushing down a little more, but I'm still sliding the knife forward. A nice tall blade like this Santoku is really going to be your friend here. You're probably going to struggle with a petty knife or something really narrow. And there we go. So we have this nice shredded radicchio now. This is gorgeous really anywhere that a bit of bitterness is nice. If you have a more buttery, fatty whitefish, for example, I like to just incorporate radicchio into salads, especially if it's a salad that's a little bit sweeter and maybe has some fruit in it. Or for a dish like katsudon, where you just want some like crisp freshness to counteract a deep fried element. I really like this cut, and I do this a lot at home, even when I'm not making fancy food. A common theme you're going to see today is texture and color and balancing out a dish. Something like this that's really crisp and crunchy and fresh, but also light and bitter, helps to offset things that aren't. You know, sweeter, jammier fruits or deep fried things. Things that are maybe a bit more heavy are balanced out really well. Same with the radishes. These paper thin radishes are really beautiful on, say, a braised lamb taco, something that's really intense that needs a little bit of freshness to cut it. On the topic of small, delicate garnishes that are great additions to dishes, we have our friend the shallot. These guys are intense, but they're really magical. They can bring a really elevated element to a dish and just make everything feel sophisticated. Brunoise is a really great cut when you have something that can easily be overpowering, so you want to take it down a notch, still incorporate it in the dish, but not overwhelm. So, we got our shallot there. We're going to take the top off, then we're just going to trim up the littlest bit of the root end there. If you've ever seen our videos on how to dice an onion, we're basically doing that, but smaller. So we're going to cut our shallot in half from top to bottom. Okay, and then peel it, obviously. So what we want to do is we want to break this up into a whole bunch of tiny little squares. So we're going to start by doing a horizontal cut in line with the cutting board. Because the shallot curves, we want to make that horizontal cut to break up those layers a little bit. We're going to bring our shallot all the way over to the edge of the cutting board. We're going to put the knife parallel to the cutting board. Instead of holding things back here, where our fingers are in the way of the knife, we're going to put our finger right on top of the shallot there. And we're just going to carefully saw the knife in most of the way back, but we want to leave just the back end of the shallot intact. Then we're going to take the tip of our knife, we're going to bring it 90% of the way to the back of the shallot. We're going to plunge it straight down and then draw back. Straight down, draw back, like so. And if some little pieces of shallot fall out here, it's not the end of the world. The idea is that we've broken up the layers this way and this way. So now, all we need to do is go over them in the opposite direction with our knife, perpendicular to the cuts that we've already made. And there we go. We have beautiful brunoise shallot. Small, very, very fine dice, like so. And this is small enough that you can incorporate that even raw into something and it's not going to take over. Or you can cook it into maybe a risotto, something very delicate, and it's going to just disappear. It's almost going to dissolve into the rice. Now, you can also brunoise an onion. It's just a little bit trickier because the onion's so much bigger and you want to make those pieces really, really small. You want really small, consistent pieces. Same as the shallot, we're going to make these cuts horizontally in. Another way you can do this if you have a nice thin knife is you can sweep in with the tip there. Just be careful. Make sure your fingers are perched on top, because if you complete that cut, you'll complete it all the way into your hand, and that's not very fun. And then we're going to cut down to the cutting board and draw our knife back. And then sometimes the onion wants to come apart on you a little bit. If a few pieces come out, it's not the end of the world, but you can always get in there and kind of hold it together as you do this. And really we're just making these cuts as close together as we can. That's what's going to dictate the size of our finished product. And then same as before, we just come across those cuts like so. Now an onion isn't as well suited to brunoise, but you can get a fairly fine dice on an onion, no problem. And you don't want to waste the back end, so you can throw that into your stock, or you can simply just slice it up and go back over it. And there you go. Again, if you're making a risotto or something where you really want your onion to disappear, this is a great way to cut it. If you want that kind of like small fragmented onion that they have on McDonald's hamburgers, that's how you would do it, right? No need for a food processor. Obviously, this is more work than throwing it into a food processor, but when presentation is important, or if you just want to have a fun time with your knife, this is a great cut to practice your knife skills on. Another good place to use a brunoise is for presentation, for finishing or garnishing a dish, especially if you want to incorporate some color. You know, if I've got a beautiful piece of sablefish, I'm not going to be sprinkling, rough chopped, large diced pieces of pepper or onion over top of it. I want like a nice, fine, almost confetti-like garnish. And so a bell pepper responds really well to a brunoise cut. Before we do this though, I'm going to show you a better way to cut a pepper. I was taught to cut a pepper by cutting it down the middle, exploding all the seeds, getting them everywhere, scooping it out, making a mess, and then having to go through and pick all the pepper seeds out by hand, which is a giant pain in the ass and just a waste of time. So instead, we are going to cut off about 10% of the bottom, like so. And then we're going to cut off enough of the top that this ring kind of holds together, but we don't want to take out the whole stem there. So about that much. That's what we're going for. These guys we're going to use, so just hang on to them. But now we are going to just open the pepper up with the tip of our knife. Then we're going to slip our knife in, and we're going to work around the core, just separating out that core in one clean piece. Not a single seed to be found, and all the nasty stuff is gone. And then we're just going to break our pepper up into a couple pieces. And at this point, you could do kind of any cut you want, right? You can cut this in half, and then you can cut it on a bias, and you can make these nice pepper diamonds for stir fry. Beautiful. But today we're going to do a brunoise of pepper. So we're going to take our piece, and notice how it's quite thick here. So if we brunoise this, we're going to almost end up with like a tiny julienne because it's quite long this way. So instead, we're going to flatten this pepper out. This is a bit of a trickier skill where you can cut yourself, so you don't have to do this, but if you want to attempt something a little trickier, this is a good way to do it. We're going to put our fingers on top of the pepper there to kind of flatten it out. Now we want to get back from the cutting board a little bit so we can see what we're doing so we don't cut ourselves. We're going to put our knife flat on the cutting board and then just lift it ever so slightly and just gently saw in, moving our fingers away from the knife as we're cutting. Like so. Then we have a much thinner piece of pepper. And if we're adventurous, we can do that one more time. Like so. There we go. And then we just stack those back up. We're going to cut them lengthwise, fairly thin, into basically a nice matchstick. And if your knife isn't sharp enough to cut through a pepper skin about that easily, it might be time to get your knife sharpened. And then we're just going to organize this into a few little piles like so, and we're going to go back across. Again, we're just using our index finger knuckle there to brace the knife. We're moving the knife back every cut, and then every 5 or 10 cuts, I bring my other hand back away from the knife, and then I lean that knuckle in and I brace again. Cut, 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 back. Cut, 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 back. Like so. With practice, you can learn to kind of caterpillar that hand back slowly, but that takes a lot of time. So I find I do half a dozen cuts, I move my hand back a little bit. Do another half a dozen cuts, move my hand back. And be cautious of this thumb here. This guy can sneak up on you and you can end up cutting your thumb. So make sure you keep him in behind. All your fingers want to be behind the leader, which is your index finger. There we go. We have some beautiful Brunoise green pepper. And again, this is really nice for a sort of confetti-like garnish. If you wanted to make almost like a micro salad or a micro Greek salsa as a garnish for something that's fairly delicate, it's a great way to get all the flavors into one bite. You're not going to end up with like just green pepper one bite and then just tomato one bite, just cilantro. You're going to get them all kind of married together really beautifully. So if you are making a fresh sauce like a salsa for a bit more of an elevated dish, you can just get everything really small like that and it comes together really nicely. Okay, so at this point in the video, you might be asking me, Nathan, why would I want to take this much time cutting stuff, right? For me, it's about the enjoyment of the process. I like cooking and I like using my fancy knives, so I like to slow down and take my time when I have the time, when I'm making a special meal. Am I going to brunoise 10 onions for a giant pot of chili? Absolutely not. That's ridiculous. If you have that kind of free time, awesome, that can be your hobby. But if you do have a lot of cooking to do, you want to spend that time where it counts, right? Do these fine cuts for the garnishes and the sauces and the things that get put on the final product. Don't do them for the stuff that's going into the roasting pan or into the sauce. You don't need to finely chop everything for your spaghetti sauce. You can throw all of your mirepoix for your bolognese into a food processor because it's just going to cook down anyways. You can save yourself 20 minutes chopping, and that's 20 minutes you can spend on the fine work at the end of the dish to really elevate it. So use your time wisely. So if you don't have a food processor at home, all you need is a good knife. All right, so we've been talking a lot about garnishes and taking flavorful ingredients and bringing them down to size a little bit. We're gonna stick with that theme for a couple more things. We are going to do a chiffonade of basil. Basil is a beautiful, beautiful herb. It's one of my personal favorites. I imagine you're probably a fan as well. And honestly, normally, if I'm just making, a caprese salad, I will just tear the basil leaf into like 2 or 3 pieces and drop it on the plate like that because it looks beautiful and artistic and Californian and blah, blah, blah. But if you want to be a little more classic or you just want a more delicate kind of garnish of basil, you can do a cut called a chiffonade. We are going to start by just piling up half a dozen leaves or a dozen leaves or so, like that. Nice and easy, right? Now, if the leaves are fairly small and fairly flat, like mint, you can just leave them flat and then cut across them, no problem. Because these basil leaves are quite curly, I'm just gonna very gently roll them up like this. Basil is quite a sensitive herb, so you don't wanna go smashing it or crunching it really aggressively. You don't wanna cook it really at all because it's gonna lose its flavor very easily. So very gently roll it up like so. And then we're gonna take our knife and we're not gonna push down at all because the more we push down through it, we're gonna bruise it. So we're gonna use our sharpest knife and we're just gonna glide the knife, making the longest cuts we can, like so. Nice and easy. And you'll notice I've got a little bit of a rock to the motion. This is not a flat-edged knife, so if I just come straight across like that, the cut's not gonna connect all the way. So I'm rocking a little bit so I get a full contact with the cutting board. Nice and easy. One thing you don't want to do, if food's piling up, you don't want to scrape the knife like that. Oh, it feels so bad. Because that's going to dull your knife and it's going to impede your ability to make those precise cuts. So instead, if things start to pile up, just pause, push them off your knife, get back to cutting. And there we go. We have now a beautiful chiffonade. We can kind of separate these strands out and you can leave these a little thicker and more rustic, or you can go even finer than I did. But these little filaments of basil are really nice, again, for garnishing. So if you have a pasta sauce, you're not gonna put these in the sauce, but you're gonna put them on your finished plate. You're gonna drape them over your spaghetti and meatballs or over your caprese salad. You can do a chiffonade of mint for finishing desserts, or even fish, something that needs a burst of freshness. Pork even would be delicious with that. So it's a really versatile cut that's really good for anything leafy and flavorful. Speaking of fresh, flavorful ingredients, we've got our good friend, the green onion. This guy, I'm sure you've seen people cut straight across or do a little bit of a bias cut, leave them a little more rough and chunky. I'm a big fan of that for soups and things where you have a lot of strong flavors going on. We're gonna go a little more delicate and we're gonna grab a different knife for this. This is a nakiri. So when we were cutting that basil, I mentioned how we have to rock the knife a little bit so we get a clean cut. The Nacuri is designed to eliminate that. It's got an almost perfectly flat edge, so when you come down on the cutting board, you get a really clean connection, and you end up with a really clean cut without having to rock the knife really. A lot of folks like a Nacuri just because it's great for vegetables, but if you are trying to do this type of cut and you're trying to do it more quickly, a Nacuri is going to mean that you can speed through more and not have to go back and pull things apart that didn't cut all the way. So we are going for the finest, thinnest, longest strand that we can get from our green onion, and so it's okay to work on a single green onion. Normally I say work smarter, not harder, cut a whole bunch at one time, but for this case, we're going for fine garnishes. So we're going to just take one. And we are going to angle the Nacuri so it's almost parallel to the green onion here. It's only coming off the green onion at about 15 degrees or so. And we're just going to gently slide that knife through. Because it's a Nacuri, we can pretty much slide it straight forward. And the tricky thing here is we're going to have our fingers along the green onion, holding it in place and keeping it straight. This is a game of constant adjustments. I find it helps to turn the green onion upwards a little bit. And I sort of roll it towards me as I go. Then you end up with these really long, skinny pieces of green onion that are really nice for traditionally garnishing ramen is sort of what this cut's for. But it's, again, just a great garnish where you want a hit of spice and a hit of freshness. You can even throw these into ice water and they'll kind of curl up and you can get these neat little piles of them. It also mellows out some of the intensity from the heat. So if you do have something that you want to garnish with just a little burst of intensity, again, ramen's a great example because it's a rich, fatty, pork-based soup. And so that little bit of spice and that zing of freshness is just going to like wake up the bowl and cut through all that fat. All right, so those are some of the finest and most delicate cuts that you're going to do. Let's go for something that's just kind of fun, a good way to spice up brunch on the weekend. So we got our friend, the avocado. Obviously, we can, smash this guy up, make some guac, that kind of thing. But I'm going to show you a little more of a delicate way to present it. So we're going to start by cutting this guy in half. You probably know how to do this, but careful with your hand. Cut straight down to the pit like so, and then just work our knife around the pit. We'll twist. Hey, look, it's like an actual ripe avocado. Like buy a lottery ticket. And then we're going to remove our avocado with a spoon. I probably don't need to tell you how to do this, but we're going to do it fairly carefully so that we are not shredding this guy. Because we want this top side of the avocado to be our presentation side. And we're going to make an avocado fan. So this is really easy. All you do, again, left hand is your guiding hand. So you're going to use that knuckle as your guide. You're going to take the tip of your knife. Don't lift it up too high because you can slice your knuckle right off doing that. So keep it nice and low and just drag the tip of the knife across the cutting board through the avocado like so. And you can make the cuts as thin or thick as you want, but since we're going for presentation here, we're going to try to make them fairly thin, fairly close together, about 1 millimeter or so. And I just like to take 1/2 like so. And then we take our hand, we're going to lay it flat, and we're just going to lean them over this way and flatten it out like so. There you have your avocado fan. Whoop. And then you can lay that on top of some avocado toast or a salad. It looks quite pretty. And it's just it's a fun way to spice up an already pretty interesting fruit, vegetable, fruit. And you can do the other half. You can obviously do the whole thing in one go. I just like to separate out that half, especially if I'm making an avocado toast for a special occasion. If you fuck up the piece, you just eat that, throw it somewhere. Now, to get the avocado pit out, you can use your knife, but because Japanese knives have thinner edges, you really shouldn't, because that twisting motion can chip your knife. I do it all the time. I wouldn't recommend it. You're going to be very sad if it goes poorly. So instead, I just use the tip of my spoon, Scoop this bad boy out. Boop. Problem solved. Now, I didn't mention earlier, but when you're selecting an avocado for presentation, you want to find one that's soft enough and ripe enough that it's going to taste like something. That's kind of the point. But you don't want one that's super, super ripe, that's, you know, guacamole texture, because they're going to be impossible to slice and present like this. So you want one that's in fairly decent shape. You're better off buying one that's a little underripe and letting it sit for a couple days if you can. So this cut, we're going to do the same thing. Dragging the tip through, using our knife to guide. We're gonna go a little thicker on our cuts, maybe closer to 2 millimeters. And we're gonna do the whole thing. And then, I'm just gonna very gently coerce it. And kind of just spread it out like so. And we have the Great Wall of Avocado, which you can then, that on its own, can go onto a plate. All right, you can pick that up with your knife, or more likely just build it on the plate like that. And that can be kind of the feature of a salad. You can also, if you're careful, you can spread it out a little more and you can wrap it around something. So say you have some tuna tartare, for example. You can serve that right in the middle and then put something crispy, crunchy on top. That'd be pretty delicious. Yeah, so these are pretty easy things to do. If your avocado is ripe, that's really clutch, and your knife is sharp, this is probably one of the easiest cuts in this video to practice. Okay, moving right along, we're gonna supreme some citrus. This is a really delicate, fancy presentation cut. Surprise, just like all the other ones. But it's a nice way to serve citrus, again, as a garnish in a fruit salad, or to a baby. So we're gonna cut the bottom of our orange off. We wanna cut in enough that we see a little bit of that flesh. We want that nice circle there. We're gonna do the same thing on the top. So we're gonna start with the tip of our knife right behind that sort of line where the pith meets the actual fruit. And we're gonna cut, sliding our knife. And as we cut forward, we're also gonna cut down and around the fruit. It's sort of a three-dimensional cut, and then we're gonna tuck in at the end. So that's what we want. Don't worry if you don't get it perfect. If you cut off a little too much, it's not the end of the world. And if you don't cut off quite enough, you can go back and clean it up. But with practice, you can learn kind of the curvature of the orange, and you should be able to get pretty clean peel. And now this may seem like a bit of a wasteful cut. We are removing a little bit of the fruit. So I don't do this all the time. If I'm eating an orange, I just, you know, eat it off the rind like a normal person. But if you do a fancy, you know, like a custard dessert that you want to add a little zing of citrus to, or you have a dish that needs, you know, maybe some jerk chicken and you want to serve it with some lime segments, this would be a really nice way to do that. And these peels, they don't have to go in the garbage either. You can use them for all sorts of stuff. What I will do is I'll just cut the excess fruit off of them, and then I'll just dry them out on a tray, and I'll use those almost like bay leaves for seasoning. If I'm making like al pastor, or I'm making a stew that requires a little bit of like oily citrusness, it's really good for that. But we should be left with an orange that's pretty much naked like that, and we can just trim off any little white bits if we missed them before. And then what we're looking to do is to remove the beautiful citrus from that pesky rind that's full of vitamins and fiber. We don't want any of the good stuff, we just want the delicious sugary fruit. So I like to use a chef's knife for this. We're gonna cut on one side of that white line, and we're not gonna cut all the way through. We're gonna stop basically right at the bottom of that segment there. It should kind of slow down, but you can do it by eye just to make sure. And then we're gonna cut on the other side of the segment. Ta-da! And I like to do this up in the air, but if that makes you uncomfortable, do it on the cutting board. Just watch your fingers, because obviously you don't want to cut them. But I find it much easier to do kind of perched up in my fingers like this. The knife doesn't get too close to my fingertips, and I can really easily see what I'm doing and control what I'm doing. And if you don't connect the cut all the way, you can just turn your knife sideways and just gently saw in. This isn't something you want to do with a dull knife. because you're gonna require too much pressure and you're gonna push the knife into your hand. So use your sharpest knife for this and work very, very gently. Now, if a big knife cutting towards your hand like that scares you because you're just a regular person and obviously that's scary and dumb, you can use a petty knife like this. I use a 135 petty knife for this job all the time. It's a lot more manageable. It's a lot lighter, so it's a lot easier to control. And ta-da, does the job just as well. What I find is important though is a lot of people tend to saw when they're doing this. You want to use the whole length of the blade because you're going to get the nicest cut, the nicest finish to the fruit. And then you have all this nice stuff in the middle left. Obviously you don't want to just throw that away. Ideally, you can squeeze that and get the juice out of it. You can slice it up into little like star shapes. And some people will dry that and add it to like homemade teas. Or you can just eat it like a gremlin, because at this point in the dinner party preparation, it's 5:30 and you haven't fed yourself all day. You're starving and your blood sugar is dipping. So you just, like so. Okay, now we can take everything we just learned on that orange, scale it up, make it easier, and do a melon. We get asked this a lot, how do I cut melon? Obviously, you can just cut it into slices, leave the rind on, and people can eat it off the rind. But if we're talking about elevating presentation today, maybe you want to make a nice prosciutto and melon. This is a really nice way to do it because it takes all the rind off. You do need a big knife for this job. Some people like to do this with a bread knife, but if you have a good knife, that's unnecessary. And so Gyuto's the way to go. We're gonna cut the top off, enough so that we can see the inside of the fruit, and same goes for the bottom. Like so. And then same deal, right? It's the exact same as what we just did. We're just gonna peel it. We're gonna start with our knife just behind that green there. And instead of sawing back and forth, you can do this and it's a little easier, but it makes kind of a rough cut. So I like to slide my knife in as smooth a consistent motion as possible. I find I slide it forward, and then once I get to the middle, I slide it back, and that works great. Slide. And I use my index finger on the side of the blade to kind of steer and guide the knife. And chances are you're not going to nail every cut here. This second cut where you come in like that, you got to tuck in a little more than you think. So if you don't do it perfectly like that one, you can just trim it up later. Not the end of the world. But we are talking about presentation, so the more consistent and smooth your cuts are, the better our end result is going to be. Okay, done. You can go back and trim up a little bit, but no need to go overboard. Okay, and then we're just going to cut this bad boy right down the middle, like so. Scoop all of the flesh out of the inside. All right, so we're peeled, we're in half, we're seeded, and now you can kind of just cut it up however you want. You know, you can dice it up for a fruit salad. If you want to make maybe a mignonette for oysters that had some melon in it, you could brunoise it. I'm sure you can figure that out. I keep it pretty simple, and basically I'll just cut it into half again, and then you can cut it basically like so. And you know, if you're just gonna eat it, that's a nice piece to eat. If I am doing a prosciutto melon, I like to make it kind of abstract and weird. So I'll like stand up pieces of melon that look like some like Eldritch alien race migrating. And I'll wrap the prosciutto around them and like drizzle it with olive oil and stuff. It's super weird looking, but you know, it's an interesting plate, and people comment on it, that's for sure. All right, the last few cuts are ones that folks struggle with sometimes. These aren't necessarily advanced knife skills, but these are things that might just help you out at home. Squash can be intimidating to cut. They are dense, they're woody, they can chip your knife if you're not careful. And if you're not like 6 foot tall and you know, confident with bigger vegetables, then they might actually scare you a little bit, which is totally understandable. So I'm gonna show you a couple ways to make it a lot less scary to cut up a squash. First thing we're gonna do, when you have something that rolls around, you want to cut a flat spot because that is dangerous to cut. So we're going to cut the top off, we're going to hold it in place, but we're going to keep our fingers away from the knife. We're we're gonna slice off that top. We're gonna spin it around, we're gonna slice off the bottom. If you find that it's getting stuck and it's a little bit hard, you can just kind of carefully, gently roll it away from you and kind of let your knife sink through it like that. That's a pretty like easy, non-scary way to cut a squash. This does double duty. This removes the stem and whatever that butt end is called, which are the things that will chip your knife if you're not careful. If you have a nice hard steel, like a Japanese knife, those things can chip your knife, so just be careful. Now we have our squash. Now it's probably tempting to cut right down through the middle of this to get it in half. And if you're just roasting it for butternut squash soup, that can be a great way to prepare it, but it's a couple of tricks that are gonna make it a lot easier. First of all, I peel my squash. I like to do it with a vegetable peeler. The skin is fairly thick on these guys, but if you do kind of a couple passes on each part and you have a fairly decent vegetable peeler, like this Kuhn Rikon guy, that's gonna work just great. You can also do it with a knife, right? If you don't have a vegetable peeler, it's not working well, you can do the same kind of thing we did on the melon. But it's a little harder to work around the contours of a squash, so you might be better off just kind of hacking at it. In all honesty, I find a vegetable peeler works well. If you have an acorn squash or kabocha squash, some of them, like kabocha I think has edible skin. They're all kind of wriggly and ribbed, and so you can't really trim them easily with a peeler or a knife. And so instead, I like to break them in half. I'll literally just drop it on the floor, I'll break in half, scoop out the seeds, and then you can roast them and then remove the skin. And that works really well because trying to peel those guys is a real pain. And trying to cut them, because they're so unevenly shaped, can be a bit of a dangerous affair. So just drop them on the floor. If you do want to cut them in half with your knife, just pop them in the microwave for a few seconds, maybe 20, 30 seconds. That'll soften up any squash and get it much easier to cut. You still got a fairly dense vegetable, and so the knife still can struggle a bit, but the skin is sort of half the problem. So we're gonna cut this guy in half down the middle, just because it's a little easier than trying to stand it up and get, like I'm a tall guy and this even is a bit high for me. So we're gonna lay it down on its side. This side, the larger side, has all the seeds, so we're gonna separate that off. And we're gonna start with our tip of the knife facing down, kind of elbow up here. We're gonna push in, and then we're just gonna follow through with the rest of the knife. And now this is kind of getting stuck, right? I could force this through, but when you're forcing your knife, that's when mistakes happen. That's when you get cut or injured. So we're not gonna do that. We're just gonna use that rolling trick again and just kind of roll the squash along the length of the knife. There we go. Look at that, TikTok taught me something. Now, this is a much smaller piece, much easier to cut in half. We can do the same thing, kind of just gently seesaw the knife through, like so. And then you can just scoop the seeds out as you would, cut it up into cubes or large chunks if you're gonna puree it later, and you're good to go. Last tip before you go. We repair a lot of knives and sharpen a lot of knives at Knifewear, and we get a surprising number of knives that are bent because somebody's been smashing garlic with their knife. Some folks will put their knife down on the cutting board at an angle, with the tip on the cutting board, and give her a whack like that. That, if you do it enough times, is really gonna bend your knife. So, bring the garlic over to the edge of the cutting board, knife parallel with the cutting board. Don't whack it, that's dangerous. Just lean on it a little bit and just crunch it a bit. There we go. Garlic, it's much easier to peel. It's nice and kind of roughed up, and then it's super easy to mince. You can just pass your knife across it. All right, thanks for watching, folks. I hope you learned something today. If you haven't watched our first knife skills video with Owen, go check that out because that really builds the fundamentals, the base that I've built off of today. And we have a lot of other great knife skills videos too on how to use certain shapes of knives. So if you want to learn how to use like a Gyuto or a Santoku or a Nakiri, any of those things, we have videos on how to do that from former chefs. And if you're struggling with precision, even after a bunch of practice, maybe it's just time to get your knife sharpened. So bring it to your local knife shop or use our mail-in service, or hey, even pick up a couple of whetstones and learn how to do it yourself. Like, oh yeah, let's have a dinner party. And then I starve myself, and then I'm not hungry by the time I've cooked all the food. And I just get wasted because I'm just drinking a bunch of wine. Dinner party tip, don't forget to eat.